Hi there and welcome to Mastering Hard Surface. For those that don't know anything about me, I've been a CGI artist for about 12 years now. I began my career as a modeler at Fuel International in Sydney, working on feature film and TVCs during the time when hard surface modeling was just starting to explode thanks to guys like Fausto Di Martini and Rene Garcia. This was a time before ZBrush or Mudbox was used in production, when studios demanded extremely high quality assets quickly and efficiently, but most importantly, these assets needed to be as low poly as possible due to the hardware at the time being significantly slower than it is today. At this time, modeling was my only passion, and I practiced literally every day for years, refining and speeding up my technique. During this time, edge extrusion modeling was quite unfamiliar to most artists, but it was the workflow I adopted thanks to the power of 3ds Max and the advanced tools it provided artists that were unmatched in other software packages at the time. So to this day, I still use the exact same method for modeling as when I started, and you will find as I go through this course that the old school technique is extremely clean and powerful, giving you the ability to model pretty much anything. So the idea behind this course stems back from before I made my Hard Surface Essentials tutorial, but due to being exhausted at the time, and you can hear that in my voice, I was doing crazy hours and wasn't really happy at that point. I had no choice but to compress my knowledge into as small a video as possible. It wasn't really an ideal situation, but that tutorial helped a lot of people understand how powerful hard surface modeling inside 3ds Max can be. It didn't really cover everything though. It was basically just the start. It was giving you the technique and the right push in the correct direction, but it didn't actually show you how to use those techniques on advanced models. It didn't incorporate any real design theory or some of the more important things that are not only going to make you understand how to model, but how to model cool things. So it's been a few years now since creating that tutorial, and I finally feel like I have the confidence again to build a new course that takes a user not only through the fundamentals, but through all of the advanced techniques and design workflows required to produce characters, robots, props, and environments. So there's going to be a lot of content created throughout this course, but we're going to start with the basics. And in this lesson, I'm going to get you up to speed with the essential hotkeys, tools, and workflows that serve as a basis for pretty much all the models I create. So unfortunately, there is going to be a little bit of information rehashed from the Hard Surface Essentials tutorial, but I don't really have much of a choice because this course is designed to take users who've never used 3ds Max all the way through to being able to create complex models like you're seeing on the screen now. So the model you are seeing now is a work in progress I've been creating to get back my speed and technique, and it's the quality I expect from each and every student by the time the course is finished. I'll be working on this during my spare time to show you guys what is possible. And even though you're seeing a really complex and detailed mesh, the technique behind creating it is quite simple. So it's always using the exact same process for pretty much everything. If you break things down, it's quite simple. So everything is just broken down into a little piece, and what kind of builds it all together is that design theory, which I'll be teaching in a later lesson. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to configure 3ds Max to behave the same way it does for me when I'm modeling. A lot of you guys who are watching this course are already going to be quite familiar with modeling inside 3ds Max, and you're going to have your own hotkeys and your own interface configured. However, this is for the guys who have never modeled before, have only just installed the application, and need to know that very basic information on how to correctly configure things to work the best way possible. So the first thing you're going to be confronted with is this very white and grey interface, which is completely fine, but throughout my whole career I've always used the darker 3ds Max interface. So the first thing you want to do is you want to go to Customize, and you want to go to Custom UI and Default Switcher, and you want to swap it to AME Dark. So this should automatically load up this darker version of the interface, which is a lot easier on the eyes when you're modeling for hours on end. You don't want the interface to really be visible to you as you're modeling. You want all your focus to be on the viewport itself. So the next thing we need to do is we need to make sure that all our hotkeys are set up correctly. So how you do that is you go to Customize, Customize User Interface, and then in this dialog box that comes up, you'll see in the categories here, you've got all commands. So by default, we can find everything we're going to change. So I'm just going to load up the hotkeys I use on the screen now, and then I'll go through and swap those all for you just to show you how to do that. I know it's really basic, but there are guys who will never have touched 3ds Max before on the course, so I've got to run through this. So what you just saw is the basic hotkeys I use in the core of my workflow. It's not every single one for every single model, but it encompasses pretty much everything that I use on a day-to-day basis while modeling. So I'm going to run through, I'm going to set those hotkeys up, and then I can get started on showing you the basic premise for hard surface modeling. So to easily find the hotkey you want to change, just type in the first letter of it. So the first we're going to change is the orbital view mode. So you just type OR, go into hotkey, and assign that to S. Next is the cut tool. So you want to click back in here and just type cut, and you'll see that there's two different types. One's cut and one's cut for poly. You want to swap the poly one. So we're going to make that T. Next is target weld. Once again, you've got it for mesh, patch, and poly. We want to change it for poly, and we're going to make that Q. The coordinates menu, which is Alt and right click, you can see here we've got world, view, screen, parent, and local. I'll bring those up later, but first we're just going to finish assigning the hotkeys, the manual hotkeys. So we want to go to edge constraint, just type in edge, and you'll see that there's edge constraint toggle, and we're going to click this to C. The next thing we're going to do is replace the maximize viewport toggle, so we're going to set that to spacebar. What that'll do is now with spacebar I can swap between each viewport. Lastly, we're just going to change the show and result mode. So down here you want to go to the second one, and we're just going to assign this to tilde. It's the little wavy key you see right next to the 1 button on your keyboard. Okay, with that being done, now we've assigned all the hotkeys I use while modeling. The rest are just defaults. So things like Z, which you saw, that will just snap you to whatever you've got selected locally. So even at a sub-object level, you can hit Z and you'll zoom to wherever you have selected, or whatever is framed on screen if you don't have anything selected. So the next thing you want to know is what parts of the interface are most useful for you when you're modeling. 3ds Max is quite a complex application if you're doing things like animation, rendering, and rigging, but when it comes to modeling, you only need to really focus on a couple of areas of the interface to make everything happen. So you've got the toolbar on the right here, which is where you've got all your create tools, so you can create all your primitives. You can also edit those primitives using the tools available here. So when you start with a primitive, if you right click it, you want to convert it to an editable poly. This is what essentially will be editing for all models on the course. Everything's going to be converted into an editable poly object. If you've got a 24-inch monitor or a 1920 by 1080 display, you want to have more room for this toolbar on the right. So what you can do is you can select the little yellow line here and drag that in. I personally like to have 3 rows in the toolbar, but you should be able to get away with 2. So let me just delete these primitives, and what we're going to be using on the course to start out with and to get familiar with modeling inside Max is just a very simple plane object. So when you create the plane, in the geometry menu on the left here, on the right there, sorry, you'll see plane. Just create a plane, and then you're first encountered with the dimensions for it and the segments and things like that. So I'm just going to reduce the segments to 1, and I'm just going to make it an even number. And you can see there how we can just very quickly edit those dimensions. The next thing you want to be aware of is where things are in the in 3D space. So you want to know where your object is sitting. So when you create a new object, you want to make sure it's centered to 0. So what I like to do is, after I create an object, just to keep things simple, I go down into the coordinates menu here, and I just type in 0, I type tab, that will bring me to the next options box. I just go 0, 0, 0. So people have worked with me, they'll see me create an object, then I go down here and I'll just go like this. And you can hear on the keyboard input that I'm just going 0 tab, 0 tab, 0 tab. That will just center it very quickly. So now you've got an object at 0. But what's happened is 3ds Max has created it with a purple wireframe. So by default, Max will always create an object with a unique wireframe. You can disable that by ticking this Assign Random Colors button. But basically, you just want to make your wireframe black on your object. So what you do is, you go up here, you click that little colorful checkbox, and go black, and now all of a sudden your object becomes black. That's because when you create a new object, it's basing its diffuse color on the wireframe color you have selected. So you need to assign a new standard shader to display in the viewport. So to do that, you can hit the hotkey M, and that will bring up the material editor inside 3ds Max. And to create a new standard material, you can see these defaults we've got here. All you do is just click the standard button and then load it up again, and you've created your own custom shader. So you can create specular levels on that, you can adjust the diffuse value, and this will serve as the base shader for displaying our model. So you've got your wireframe set up correctly, you've got your geometry centered. Now you need to start familiarizing yourself with the editable poly object itself. So like I was saying, at the moment this object is still just a plain object, and basically every object is made up of vertices, edges, polygons, and the element itself, which is the whole object. So by default, 3ds Max gives you primitive options where I can adjust the length and width, but when we convert this to an editable poly, we're collapsing down those settings into its just raw form of vertices, edges, polygons, and the element itself. So what you want to do is you want to right click the plane and convert it to an editable poly object, and then you're confronted with all the tools that you are capable of adjusting the model with in this right hand toolbar. So a lot of people, what I see is they use the selection button here to swap between the sub-object selection modes. What I mean by that is that instead of clicking 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 to select these sub-object modes, I see people go in and click it here, which is extremely slow. So you need to get used to using 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 to change between your selection mode. So with 1, you can select the vertices. With 2, you can select edges. With 3, you can select the border. With 4, you can select the faces. And with 5, you can select the element. I'll demonstrate that by showing you here. If I have 2 polygons, when I select 1 polygon, it's only selecting that, but when I select the element, it selects the whole object itself. So once you get used to using 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 to change between those sub-object modes, and if you're just starting out in Max and you're not doing that, you have to convince yourself to use these hotkeys, because you're going to be so slow when modeling. I've seen co-workers do it who've been modeling for years, and it's crazy. It's just simply crazy. So you need to get used to doing that. So the basic premise for my workflow is, and this is where I'm reiterating from the Hard Surface Essentials tutorial, is that the way I model is using edge extrusion. So basically, inside 3ds Max, you have the ability to start out with a plane, go to edge sub-object mode, which is using 2, and if you hold down Shift and drag, you can drag out new polygons from that edge. And it gives you the ability to very quickly block out objects and define what you want to do with your object. So what's kind of most important when you're doing this is that you've got 2 different ways in which you can drag out. And this is where you need to get used to the coordinate system in 3ds Max. So by default, you'll notice up here you've got this coordinate system and it's set to view. So that's giving you the option to use the X, Y, and Z axis to drag out where you want your polygons to go, as well as using this kind of multi-sub-object mode where you can drag out in both directions. So you can drag out on the X and Z. So if you drag out on specific axes here, you hover over the axis you want to drag out from, and once it highlights yellow, you know you've got that locked off. So if you can see, if I hover over the blue, I've got that locked off. So you need to make sure you're not hovering over these main double selection methods, because then you're going to select both. And when you go to drag out, it's not going to move straight. So you can see here, if I've got the Z and the X selected, I can drag out left and right. But if I hover over just the blue, I can't do that anymore. So even though my mouse is moving to the right here, it's locking it off to that selection. Okay, so why do I have S selected for the arc rotate view mode, when by default you can use Alt and middle mouse to do the same thing? So right now I've got Alt and middle mouse selected, and I'm doing the exact same thing as if I had this arc rotate mode selected. Now the reason behind that is when you start modeling quickly and when you start modeling over a long period of time, you want to minimize the amount of use of pressing buttons. So when I'm holding down the middle mouse on this mouse, I've got a Logitech G9, I'm putting extra pressure on my finger that I don't need to. So if I'm modeling for 10 minutes, it's not going to make a difference. But if I'm modeling over 10 hours and I'm modeling non-stop, every time I go and select that middle mouse, it's fatiguing my finger. And you might be thinking that's a little bit extreme, like how bad can it get? Well, that's a very bad cause for RSI, using that middle mouse button to constantly add pressure to your finger. So what I like doing is, and I figured this out very early on, that it was much more efficient for me to click S and then let go of my left hand entirely, stretch it out. So even though I don't have a webcam at the moment, when I click S, usually what I'm doing is I'm clicking it so I'm giving my left hand a break. Because as I'm modeling, I've got all these hotkeys selected, and your hand becomes a little bit stiff, and it kind of you get stuck in a very static rhythm where you're not moving anything, you're not getting circulation to your fingers, you're not taking breaks. And so I've needed to make sure that I'm constantly relaxed and I'm constantly avoiding my fingers getting fatigued. Because once they are fatigued, and once you do feel that RSI feeling that anyone who hasn't modeled before will eventually feel, it's not very great, and it takes quite a while for your muscles to relax and get over that pain. I mean, I've seen co-workers work so hard that, I mean, I've done this myself, where you end up working with an ice pack under your wrist, and it's just ridiculous. So do whatever you can to avoid yourself becoming stiff while modeling. So when I click S, I've got the ability to use my right hand freely, and all I've got to do is just click down with the left button, which takes a lot less stress than the middle mouse button. So getting back to when I was talking about how you can extrude out edges to create new polygons, I don't always use the view axis mode, and that's because sometimes you've got geometry that's on a slightly different angle. Say if I've got like a a face that's coming out like this, and I don't want it to drag out straight like that because now the geometry's changed, what I can do is I can click Alt and right click, and that'll bring up a shortcut for the different axis view modes. It's the exact same as clicking up here, but when you click Alt and right click, your mouse is much closer to those settings. So I can be rotating around an object. If I've got it set to view mode, when I go to drag out there, sometimes I want to drag out with screen mode. And what screen mode will do is it changes the axis that you're dragging out with to be orientated to the screen. So say if I right click and I go to screen, you can see now I'm presented with a 2D gizmo. So I can drag out directly from the screen. And sometimes that's what you want while modeling. So I'll just go back. So like I was saying, if by default you're at view, sometimes you need to go Alt right click and quickly swap it to screen. I don't use parent or local or world really. It's really just between view and screen that you need to swap between. If you're not planning to work in screen mode for a long time, you've also got this little center gizmo here, which will do the same thing as working in screen mode, but it's a little bit faster. So when I swap to edge mode here and drag around, I can hold shift and drag from that center gizmo, and that will give you the ability to use screen mode there. A lot of the times I'm working in screen mode more than once, and this is a tiny little gizmo. It's a bit harder to see, so it's much quicker for me to use this bigger area than this small one. I like to make things easy for me when I'm selecting because I don't want to miss. And when you've got a little gizmo that's small, sometimes you miss it. You'll be working quickly, you'll be coming through, and you're sitting there and you click that accidentally, and then you miss it again, and it's frustrating. Whereas if you've got a bigger gizmo to work with, it's much easier. So how you can enable that is, if it's not enabled by default, go to Customize, Preferences, and go to Gizmos, and you'll see this center box handle. It'll say Move in Screen Space. So if I disable that, I've disabled that center gizmo. So I know we're moving through things slowly here. I just want to make sure that the guys who haven't used Max before have enough information in a format that's easy for them to swallow, and we will be getting onto the advanced stuff later, but this first lesson I just need to go through and make sure everything's set up correctly for people, so I'm not getting those same mundane questions about am I working in the correct method. So now that we're starting to get a bit familiar with how to work with the object, how to work with different screen modes, the next thing you need to understand is some more advanced shortcuts such as looping and ring selecting your geometry. So I was saying earlier you can swap between vertices, edges, borders, polygon, and the element itself, but within those you can create sub-selections such as ring selections and edge loop selections. So what I mean by that is I'll go here, I'm going to swap to view mode, and if I just drag out some polygons, in Max you've got a couple of nice shortcuts that will just very quickly make you select a loop. So if you double select an edge, you'll select the whole loop along that edge. And if you select an edge and then shift select the adjacent edge to it, you'll select the ring along there. And then you start having the ability to use these tools that we're seeing on the right here. So you've got all sorts of different tools. I'll use things like connect, and you can use things like bridge, so you can bridge between two polygons. So all these tools here, I'll start to explain those. But basically that's the next lot of things you'll need to get used to doing. I used to have hotkeys set up where I'd use Control R to select a loop and Control W, but since then 3ds Max has automatically implemented these shortcuts which let you do it much faster. So those are the methods I use. So what you'll start to notice is that all these hotkeys I use are kind of centered around that left hand area, and I'm not using so many hotkeys that I need to move my hand around too many places. It's all pretty centered around that S key. So I constantly have my middle finger on S, and that's what I use to click it, and everything else is just using around it. Okay, so on top of being able to move things in screen mode, and view mode, the next hotkeys you need to get used to are W, E, and R. And those are your move, rotate, and scale shortcuts. So these are these buttons up here. And once again, just like I've seen people use this toolbar for swapping between vertices, edges, borders, and polygons, I see people use these hotkeys in the viewport to change those options. So instead of using these buttons up here, just use W, E, and R. I know it seems obvious, but I've got to say it. So when I select an edge, W will let it move, E will let me rotate it, and you can lock onto those axes just like I was saying before, and R will scale it. So those are the very basics of how to work with an object and how to make sure you're set up in the fastest way possible, using the least amount of shortcuts to do the majority of your work. So now that you've got an idea of how to do those things, the next thing you need to understand is the edge extrusion modeling technique as a whole. So when you're dragging out edges and things like that, you don't want to drag out those edges unless you can see what the end result looks like. So what we're seeing here is an unsubdivided model. So the whole idea behind edge extrusion modeling is that you're seeing the final result while you're modeling. And to do that, you need to subdivide your model. So you've got a couple of different options here, and once again, I know this will seem obvious for a lot of you, but I've seen co-workers do it at different places, and it always kind of bewilders me why, but I've just got to mention it. So you've got a couple of different methods for subdividing your mesh. So one of those is using NURM subdivision, which is a very old version inside Max of subdividing your object. So you can see with NURMs enabled, now that when I drag and move this object, we're seeing a subdivided version of it. But unfortunately, this isn't exactly NURMs is a lot slower, and when you're dealing with an object that's very high res, you want to use a modifier in your stack. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back into the full object mode. So I'm just going to, when you're in vertice mode and stuff, you're only visible with these tools. So I'm just going to unselect use NURM subdivision. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the modifier stack window here, and I'm going to apply a turbo smooth modifier. You can assign a shortcut to this. Sometimes what I like doing is I'll go into customize user interface and go to turbo smooth. And because I don't have F assigned to anything, that's just the front view. When I do that, when I hit F, it automatically assigns that turbo smooth modifier. And you'll see by default, the iterations is just showing you how many times it's subdividing each polygon twice as high res as it was before. So what it's doing is, the way turbo smooth works is it's averaging out between 3 points in 3D space. So you can see here what it's doing is it's the exact same as if you had a 2D graph from the side. So let me just reset my views here. And you can see I've got this mesh from side on, and it's just averaging out between those two points. Now what you're seeing is there it's averaging out between 2 points on just one axis, but it will also do it on all 3 axes. So if I double select that loop and drag out, now it's averaging out between 3 points. And this is where the power of edge extrusion modeling comes from. The ability to drag out in real time and see what type of effect you're having on your object. So earlier on I was saying I had show and result mapped. What show and result is going to do is it's going to let you use turbo smooth while you're modeling. So while I'm dragging that out, I can see the total effect it's having on the object as I go. What's quite annoying is though, by default, when you have the Turbo Smooth modifier applied, is that you don't have this isoline display box ticked. So what I want to do is I want to see my raw object just with smooth on it. So now when I drag out, I can see the effect that the smooth object has without all those extra subdivisions kind of cluttering my view. So you're not just limited to dragging out from one point or one loop. You can shift drag out from any number of points. So if I go to border selection mode now and I use the scale tool, I can hold shift and I can drag out all 4 of those points at once. So very quickly you can kind of control things like circular insets and pretty much any points. Any edges you select, they don't need to be next to each other. I can control select the next edge and drag up. And you can see it doesn't matter. So you don't need to just drag from that one point. Let's move on and take a look at some of the tools used in each sub-object selection mode. So let's take a closer look at some of the tools that you're going to be using while doing hard surface modeling. I've tried to limit this to the bare minimum. Occasionally you'll use a different tool set, but for 99% of the stuff we'll be doing, these are the tools we'll be using. So you'll notice first off that when you swap between each sub-object mode, the toolbar changes here. And that's because you've got different options available for each sub-object mode. So in vertice mode, the first tool I'll show you is the chamfer tool. And remember, some of these toolboxes have a separate options box next to them. So by default, if you click the button, what it will do is it will bring up the quick version of that tool, and you can just drag in the viewport here and do it that way. Or if you want more control, you can click on the options box next to it and use the little tabs menu here to change that. If you ever want to reset to 0, all you need to do is right click on the option box, thanks Connor, and that will reset those settings for you. Okay, next in vertice sub-object mode, you've got the cut tool. So I'm just going to create a little bit of extra geometry first. So I'm going to swap to 2 and go back into edge mode, and we're just going to drag out some edges. And what you'll notice is I've accidentally got edge constraint mode selected down here, which we set to C. So I'm going to turn that off. I'm going to drag out some edges just so I've got a little bit of information to show you what the cut tool's doing. So now we've got a bit of geometry there, and if I swap back to 1 and then go T, now I've got the ability to cut while I'm seeing what's happening on the mesh. All the while I've got my hand over the show and result shortcut button so that while I'm modeling I can get an idea of what's actually happening, and I'm making sure that I'm not selecting the wrong part of the mesh. So as I'm cutting closer to the mesh, you'll notice it's creating a harder edge there. And this is while I'm creating certain organic shapes and things like that, where that's extremely useful to have that cut tool. Now you can cut through other bits of geometry. You don't have to do it cleanly. So you can see you can cut wherever you want. And as long as I use that same setup where I'm hitting C to rotate, show and result, and then back to T, I can cut and I can make more edge loops, and what that's going to do is it's just going to create a harder edge in places where there's more loops. Okay, lastly I can weld 2 vertices in vertice sub-object mode. So if I click this button here, you'll notice it hasn't done anything, and that's because in the options box the weld threshold hasn't been high enough to work. So now that I've set the weld threshold to be greater than the distance between those 2 points, it's welding them together. I can click plus and then select the next loop, and you'll see it's just welded them together. Now what you'll notice is, now that I've gone above that, what it does is, what 3ds Max does is it saves the settings from the last time you used a tool. So now when I select these two vertices, it's going to use the same settings of 6.2 centimeters to weld them. And if I just click the button, it's much faster. So those are the three main tools I use in vertice subobject mode. In edge subobject mode, I either like to use extrude, and what that'll do is if I click that, it's just going to give you the option to extrude out in a similar way to how I'm doing with shift and drag. But the difference here is when I use the actual tool itself, is it can extrude out along the normal of that edge. So you'll notice when I'm doing it this way, it's extruding out along the normal of this edge. Whereas if I just go and shift drag out, I can't do that. So that's where it can be beneficial to use that. The next tool in edge subobject mode is the chamfer tool. Now you'll remember in vertice mode, it's the same tool, but this is having an effect on the edge itself. So if I select that loop there and use the chamfer tool, I can just split that along the edges. But I never really like to do that manually. I always have this as an option box, because this option box gives you that little bit more information to add more detail to your mesh. So what I mean by that is you've got option boxes here to have an open chamfer. If you tick that, it's just going to split them and create the open edge. Or you can add individual edges in between, which is going to give you a nice rounded edge if you're doing bevels or things like that. So you don't have to add those support loops. You can always just go smaller, and you can see how if I go smaller, it's having a similar effect as if I go bigger and add more loops. Okay, the next thing you can do in edge mode is you can bridge two loops themselves. So if I drag these out here and get rid of this inside loop, now I can select these two adjacent edges and use the bridge tool, and it's going to just combine those again. So just like chamfer, you can use the options box, and you've got a bunch of different settings to use here. Okay, so another tool I use in edge mode is the edge constraint toggle. So what does this tool do? It's probably one of the most important tools in the asset. It's one of the most important assets you have while you're modeling. What this tool does is, if I just drag out some edges here, right, is it will snap your selection to the edge which you're basing it on. So if I click C, which is the shortcut for that, now I can't move anywhere but along the angle at which that polygon resides on. So it's snapping it to that. Even if I use the x-axis mode with it off, you can see it's dragging out. But as soon as I turn that on and use that, it's sliding it down those edges. So it's an extremely important tool. I'm just running you through the tools I use at the moment, but once we start creating some shapes, I'll explain the power of that and how that helps keep your meshes clean. In edge mode, you can still use cut. It's identical to using vertice mode. So if I swap to vertice mode, you can see I can do the exact same thing. And lastly, we've got the polygon subobject tools used. So firstly, you can use the extrude tool. And once again, that's got an option box as well. And you can extrude by the normal. So what I'll do is here is just to demonstrate that. If I drag out and select all these polygons, now when I extrude, if I go by normal, it's going to push them out along the axis in which this normal of this face is coming out at. So lastly is the inset tool. And all this will do is just pushing the polygon inside the selection you have. So if I select a bunch of them, you can see here how it's just pushing them in. You can do it via Polygon itself, which I don't use often. But this is for times when you want to add like a little circular inset to the object, and I'll show you that next. So these are all the basic 3ds Max tools I use. Now there's one last tool that I use, which is an extension of the 3ds Max tools, and it was written because of my Hard Surface Essentials tutorial, where I was using a really complex method to generate circular insets in the polygons. So it's called Loop Regularizer, and basically if you go to scriptspot.com, I'll provide a link for this as part of the download for this lesson. What you do is you just go here and download this script. So once it's downloaded, locate where it downloaded to, and all you need to do is you just need to drag it into the 3ds Max viewport, and that will automatically install it for you. So once you've done that, you'll see now that I've got the ability to, what this tool does is it creates a perfect circular face out of the selection you have. And it doesn't matter how many polygons you have selected, it will still make a completely clean version of that. So let me just add a little bit of information to this object. So now if I select all these points, which are completely random, and I use that inset tool, which is what we were using last, now if I right click, I can click regularize, and it's going to create a perfect circular inset of that, which is extremely useful, you'll see later on, for when we want to create holes for bolts and things like that. So those are all the tools I use, and I know it's a little bit boring running through them, but I've got to do it, and later on when I'm using these tools on more production assets and things like that, I'm going to explain to you their importance at different points in time of the mesh creation process. So that wraps up the first lesson. I know it's very basic, but I do have to target the course for guys who haven't used Max before. I really appreciate your support in buying this course. It's made a massive difference to my personal life. I need you guys to understand that a lot of the money I make from the course I'm investing back into it, and I've got a new website along the way that's going to make things a lot easier for subscribers. On top of that, it's funding all of my personal boxing goals. So I've got my first fight lined up next month, which I'll post online, and I think it's good to know that I'm not doing this just to make a quick buck and then, disappear. Like, this is a long-term goal for me. I really want this course to build up to the point where you are producing models like you're seeing on the screen, because they really do only use the techniques you just saw. So if I just select one object, for example, and zoom in, you can see it's very, very basic. And all those tools I just showed you are all there. So the inset tool I just used, for example, if I delete these points and I mess that up, if I go back and use that regularize tool, I've just created that circular inset again. The same goes for all the vertice sub-object selections. The way I model stays the same the whole way. So in the next lesson, what I'm going to get down to is I'm going to start covering some of the basic design principles behind my work, because you'll notice it's very curvy and everything kind of is trying at least to flow together. So now in the next lesson, we're going to start building up some of the shapes using the workflows and tools that I've explained in this lesson. Once again, I just want to thank everyone for subscribing. I really appreciate it, and I'm really looking forward to making this course a fully complete and fully enclosed modeling course for anybody who's never done it before and wants to do the type of work you see in cinematics and game covers and film.